am Dr. Pavitra Bharadwaj. I am Associate Professor in the Department of Computer Science in Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi. So friends, we have been talking about the data mining domain in this series, and today's lecture will be the 7th lecture in the series of data mining. So in the last few lectures we have talked about the basics of data mining, the introduction to the field of data mining, the very nature of the field, how interdisciplinary it is, how much it borrows from statistics and other domains. Then we had talked about the issues related to data, how do we identify the data, and very importantly the quality of data. So today we will again be continuing with the topic of data quality, and we will also look at the issue or the aspect of pre-processing the data, that is preparing the data for data mining, how to make the data of a reasonable quality so that it can be used by the data mining algorithms efficiently on a system. So in our discussion about data quality, we talk about 4 different types of issues that one encounters when we look at data sets, because we understand that the data which is given for the data mining tasks, many a times that is not gathered or that is not collected for that for that particular task per se. That is, the objective of data collection was something else, and now the data has been given to the analyst for analyzing it. So therefore many a times the analyst finds a lot of issues with the quality of the data which has been given to it, and of course it is very well evident that if the quality of the incumbent data is not satisfactory, then we cannot expect very good results out of the analysis of the data also. So therefore there are 4 main issues which are faced by a data analyst while analyzing these data sources, which could be coming from various areas like sensor based data or internet based data, or it could be coming from experimental data, so any kinds of data. So the first issue that we discuss is the issue of outliers. So we had discussed that outliers basically are those objects which whose characteristics are different from most of the other data objects in the data set, right. So therefore sometimes these are also known as anomalous objects, or they are known as abnormal objects, right. So here the value of that particular attribute will be unusual in respect to the typical values of that attribute. So therefore this is known as an outlier because it is not falling within the range or within the expected range of the values for that particular attribute. So therefore it is very important that these outliers should be considered, because they are irrespective to noise and the other kind of artifacts in the data which we are seeing. Outliers can sometimes be giving legitimate information and sometimes even very valuable and significant information, and therefore it is very important that outliers are detected and they are handled very carefully. So we have discussed earlier also that in case of say credit card frauds or bank frauds, right. So these outliers values will be something like a transaction which has been made in an area which generally the transactions are not made from that particular area, or the user is trying to use the credit card for a value, the transaction value is much above or much below the normal range of transaction values for that card. So all these will be outlier values, but definitely they will be very interesting and there will be very important that these outliers are detected. Then we had talked about an aspect of missing values also, that is the object does not have a value, the attribute values for certain objects are missing. Now this could be for different reasons, whether the value was not supplied. For example, certain people do not want to reveal their age, so if data is being gathered, so they are not revealing their age, so that value will be missing value. Others could be that the value is not applicable, right. Like for example in various kinds of online forms where we have option, we have a decision, and based on a condition the user will give a particular set of information or they may not give. So it is like some places the data is not given and other places the data may not be applicable to all objects. So, in either case, you know, the missing values are there and they have to be accounted for while, you know, the data is being analyzed. So, different strategies can be used for these missing values, like, you know, we can fill in the value by estimation, by, you know, taking out the mean of the other value, or we can put the closest value of another data object, we can fill in that value, or the other option could be to simply delete the data objects for which the values are missing, or the other could be to ignore that particular attribute for which the value is missing. So, there can be various strategies, you know, which are employed for dealing with missing values. Then we have another issue of inconsistent value. So, inconsistent values, you know, inconsistent value could be something like, you know, if we have a data set in which we have data about cities, okay, and we have zip codes also. Now, inconsistency could be crept in, you know, if for example, a data entry operator is entering the zip code of a particular city, but mistakenly, you know, he makes a typing error. So, therefore, now the zip code is not matching with the name of the city. Or it could be, you know, that while the form, the data was being read from a handwritten form, and the value was misread from that form. So, irrespective of this, that, you know, from where, what is the source of the inconsistency, the inconsistencies are often seen in the data sets. So, some types of inconsistencies, they are rather easy to detect, like the one I just said, that, you know, the zip codes and the cities are not matching. So, this is very easy to detect because the zip codes of all cities are very well known, right. But and in some other cases, it is not easy to look at the data and find out the inconsistency. So, in those cases, an external source of information has to be referred. Like for example, you know, the insurance companies. So, whenever they get an insurance claim, they get a form in which, you know, the user or the customer is giving their data. So, they will always compare the data which is given by the user with the data in their database, so that they will check that there is no inconsistency within the data. And once the inconsistency has been detected, once it is known that there is an inconsistency, then the data needs to be corrected, the inconsistency needs to be removed. So, the correction of this inconsistency will further require additional or redundant information, right. So, some inconsistency, like for example, if you know the value of an object is in negative, so that kind of a inconsistency can be easily be detected. Say if age cannot be negative or height cannot be negative, so that is very easy to detect, but certain inconsistencies can be difficult to detect and they need to be handled very, very carefully. Next, you know, problem that we face, or that the data analysts face in the quality of the data, is duplicate data. Duplicate data, you know, it could be that the same object has been given twice. Like for example, we see that sometimes, you know, people will get multiple emails from a particular source. This is because the person's data is, you know, the person's record is occurring at multiple places in the database, right. So, the data set is including the data object which is duplicate, right. Or, you know, another kind of duplicacy could be that, you know, that there are two objects which actually are, you know, they are having the values of the attributes are very similar, but they represent two different objects. Like for example, two people, they can have the same names, right. So, that does not mean that the record corresponds to one single object, but it corresponds to two different objects in that case. So, either way, you know, it is important that the duplicate values are detected and they are eliminated, right, because if it is that two objects are actually representing one single object, then it is further going to cause inconsistent values and therefore more errors will be crept in, right. So, the process which is used for, you know, removal of these duplicate values is known as deduplication, right. So, deduplication means that we are dealing with the issues related to duplicate value, right. So, deduplication is used. Now, in some cases, two or more objects which are identical with respect to the attributes, they are measured by the database, but they still represent different objects. So, in this case, where the attribute values are the same, but the objects are actually different, then these duplicates are legitimate, right. But still they can cause problems, because there are algorithms which are not designed in a way so that they can take care of this possibility of identical objects. So, therefore, handling of duplicate values within a data set is very critical to any data mining task, right. Now, these were some issues which were related to the data per se, right, the quality issues related to the data per se. Now, we also encounter quality issues which are related to applications, right. So, basically, what is the quality definition? The data, we will say that any data is of high quality if it is suitable for its intended use, right. So, the data has to be aligned with the purpose for which the data has been collected, the purpose for which the analysis is to be done, right. So, therefore, particularly in the case of businesses, in the case of industry, where we have very targeted objectives for the results, or we have very targeted, we have very focused approach for analyzing the data. In that case, we have to align the data along with the purpose, and the algorithms also have to be defined, right. So, quality issues at the measurement and data collection level, they have to be we have to keep in mind the specific particular applications and the fields for which the data is going to be used, right. So, for example, the first attribute in this case, or the first concern in application related quality aspect of data, is the timeliness of data. That is, how timely the data is. Sometimes we see that the data will start to age as soon as it has been collected, right. For example, if it is a snapshot of some ongoing phenomena or process, right, then the snapshot will represent the reality of the situation only for a limited time. For example, if we are looking at the web browsing of a person, right, the pattern of web browsing of a person. Now, this is a screenshot, or this is a momentary information, this is an instantaneous piece of information which has to be collected. So, if this data is not used there and then it will become outdated, right. The data will only be relevant for a very short period of time. So, therefore, this out of date data or outdated data, you cannot use this data for building any kind of model or for finding out any kind of pattern, because if the data is outdated, so the pattern or the model which is being developed on that data will also be outdated. Then the second aspect is relevance of the particular data, that is the information, the data which is being collected should provide the information which is necessary for the application that it is being used for, right. That is, the data, the object in a data set are relevant is also very important. Like, for example, if we are collecting information about road accidents, right, that is the role of drivers in road accidents. So, if you are collecting data about the drivers, then it is very important that you collect the data about the age and the gender of the drivers also, because that is going to actually reveal a lot of important information, a lot of important insight into that data. But if we are not collecting this information, if we are overlooking this relevant information from the database, then our data will not be of a suitable quality, because it is not going to give the relevant results, right. Another problem which can come is around the sampling bias, right. That is, the sample which is being used, it contains different kinds of objects in proportion to the actual occurrence in the population. So, if your sample which you are using for analyzing, if that sample is suffering from sampling bias, then also your data will not be relevant, right. So, basically, like for example, the data of the results of a survey, right? If we are conducting a survey, then the results of the survey will depend upon the people who responded to that survey. So the analysis will also only show the data about the objects which have responded into the survey, right? So those who did not participate in the survey, their reflections will not be shown in the analysis. So then in that case, you cannot say that the survey results are correct, or they are actually representing the broader population. So therefore, all these aspects related to the information relevance in the data set, and also how the sampling of the data has been done, are important. We will also be discussing about sampling later on when we talk about the techniques. But at the moment, it is important to understand that how proper sampling and keeping the sampling bias in control is important to manage the quality of the data. Then another aspect related to the application related quality is the knowledge about the data. So generally we see that the data sets, they come with a documentation, and this documentation basically will describe the aspects of the data, and hence any person who is going to look at the data set will refer to the documentation. Now this documentation therefore becomes very important, because it can either aid or it can hinder the subsequent analysis. Like for example, if the documentation identifies attributes which are strongly related to each other, right? So therefore it will be assumed that if the attributes are strongly related, so they will provide highly redundant information, and therefore the analyst can only take one of those attribute. Like for example, if your data set has two attributes, sales tax and purchase price. Now these two attributes are so closely related to each other that only one of these may be considered, right? So if your documentation about the data is poor and it fails to tell the real problem, like for example, if in the data set the missing values are represented by a particular symbol, say -999, okay, then if it is not written, if it is not clearly mentioned in the documentation, then the entire analysis will be faulty, because this information, this is a missing value which has been filled to show the missing values, that is also going to be considered as the data. So therefore the precision of the data, the type of the features of the data, the scale of measurement, for example, whether the measurement was done in feet, or it was done in meters, or it was done in centimeters for length, and also the source or the origin of the data. All this information is very vital for any analyst. So therefore complete knowledge about the data comes from the documentation, and hence the quality of the documentation will also be very, very critical in determining the quality of the process. So friends, this was the discussion about the data quality aspect, and how the data quality is also determined by the application for which the entire process has been created. Now generally what happens is that after the data is gathered, it has to undergo a certain amount of data pre-processing, because we have seen that the data will have missing values, inconsistent values, duplicate values. So in order to remove all these quality issues in the data pre-processing is carried on. So data pre-processing basically is a broad area which consists of a number of different strategies and techniques which are interrelated in complex ways. So different tools, different techniques will be used for getting the data prepared, for making up the data for the task of data mining. So the goal is to improve the data mining analysis with respect to time, cost and quality, right? So we need to optimize the data so that it will use the least amount of time, it will be the most cost effective, and the results will be of the highest quality. So multiple approaches they are used for data pre-processing, and some of these approaches we will be discussing. So, these approaches could be aggregation, they could be sampling, there is dimensionality reduction, then feature subset selection, feature creation, discretization and binarization, and variable transformation, right. So, these are the few techniques of data pre-processing that are discussed. Now, it is very important here to understand that some of these techniques, they undertake the task of grouping of the attributes, or bringing the attributes together, whereas the other few, they look at creating of new attributes from the pre-existing attribute, so that the data becomes more precise, right. So, all these techniques are basically focusing on either of this aspect, that is grouping of the data objects or their attributes, and or they are looking at creation of new attributes from the existing attributes in order to optimize the data mining task. So, first and foremost of these techniques is aggregation, right. So, aggregation basically is a technique which is based on the philosophy of less is more. Less is more means that we are going to combine two or more objects into a single object, right. So, why are we doing this? Simply we have understood this, that all this is being done so that we have limited number of data attributes, right. So, we are going to combine objects into a single object, and we are going to look at the aggregate values. Instead of looking at the individual data object, we are going to look at a composite value of the aggregate, right. So, if we consider a data set which is having transactions or data objects, in which the daily sales of products in various store locations of different days over the course of year are recorded. So, if we look at this data table, so in this basically what is stored is, we have the different transactions happening in different stores of a supermarket, okay, which are at different locations on particular days, and the data is being collected for say one full year, right. So, we understand that there will be thousands of data objects which will be present in this data source, because it will have customer purchase for each store, for each item stored separately. Now, this kind of a data set will be very difficult to handle unless we try to aggregate the information which is represented in this type of data set. So, what are the different ways on which the information can be aggregated? So, information is, in this case we aggregate the information on the transaction, right. That is how the value of each attribute is combined across all the records corresponding to a particular location to create the aggregate transaction that represents the sales of a single store or a particular date, right. Say for example, in this case, if we are looking at the store location, so we will, instead of looking at transactions, we will club all the transactions of a particular store which happened on a particular date. So, now instead of having multiple transactions shown for each store, we will only have that many transactions in the table as there are number of stores. So, what have we resulted into? Instead of having thousands or tens of thousands of transactions or data objects in the data set, now we have come to a few hundred transactions, because each day's transactions will be shown and every data store will have a single object in the transaction. So, friends, we will be continuing with our discussion on aggregation in the next lecture. Till then, please keep watching CEC. Thank you.